So, welcome to episode 48 of Consensus on Reality. It's been a while since we've had a guest, and today we are joined by Bram Stoker Award-winning author Nicole Cushing, the author of such works as A Sick Grey Laugh, Mr. Suicide, and the upcoming Mothwoman. And I had sort of separately from the realm of the consensus on reality stuff, just as like a fan of like weird fiction and horror and stuff, had been familiar with Nicole's work and really enjoyed it. And then I saw that she had been posting about like the shaver mythos and stuff like that on Twitter. So I was like, that's kind of a cool connection. And so I thought that could be a cool kind of angle, because we've never actually interviewed a writer of fiction before, really, at least not a person primarily known for that. So that's interesting. So thanks for coming, Nicole. How's it going?
Oh, it's wonderful and great to be here, and nice to meet you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
I thought an interesting way to start talking about this would be like, do you see, I mean, so in your writing, there's obviously a sort of supernatural, like what, whatever that word might be, there's this sort of extra normal forces that, come into play, often with pretty gory results. Have you been interested in sort of like the supernatural in addition to your sort of horror background, or how do you feel about that?
Well, for a long time, I would have told you that I was an atheist, and I was an atheist. I probably throughout my writing career, as I wrote Mr. Suicide, as I wrote A Sick Grey Laugh, I was an atheist, and I didn't really make any connection between the paranormal as a subculture or as a set of experiences that people had and what I was doing as a writer of fiction. And I was looking at it purely as an artistic endeavor. I still really do look at it primarily as an artistic endeavor. And I don't necessarily focus too much on the paranormal. But at that point, I was... well, actually, let me pause and re-clarify there, or rather clarify. I won't say that I don't focus on the paranormal, but I'm first and foremost a novelist, and I'm first and foremost a creator. But certainly my mind has been opened to paranormal topics in recent years. So up until about, I would say 2018 or 2019, I was a stone cold skeptic. I would have been in the debunker camp. I was a big fan of, The Amazing Randy.
Yeah.
Purely 100% in that camp. And there's a long tradition of horror writers who write works of very feverish imagination as far as fiction goes, but have a very strict skeptical side. First and foremost, H.P. Lovecraft comes to mind, who is a very ardent atheist, back in a time when it was very difficult to be an ardent atheist. But at the same time wrote these kind of fever dream works of fiction. So that became just some very highly emotional, nightmarish sorts of stories. So there's a tradition of that. But I would say in 2018, actually on my wedding anniversary, was my 11th wedding anniversary, I went to a state park. My husband and I often go to state parks for our wedding anniversary. And there was a waterfall there. And I was involved in just doing, secular mindfulness meditation. That was, always a part of my kind of secular spirituality. And during that meditation, I had a very strong spiritual experience that I cannot explain. And And so my mind became open. My husband was there with me at the same time. He did not have that kind of experience. He remains a very ardent skeptic and atheist, which is probably good because it helps me stay tethered to the ground sometimes. But since that time, it really led me to question my beliefs. And then in May of 2020, the door to the paranormal swung open even further when I made a pretty unexpected visit to Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
Uh-huh. I guess the book that's coming out this year is Mothwoman. So is that kind of is it? I mean, because was A Sick Gray Laugh your last like full length thing that came out?
Yeah, that was my last novel in 2019.
Yeah. So is this one similarly kind of playing with that like metafictional kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say so. It's for example, okay, so May of 2020, it's the early part of the pandemic, and I was laid off from my job as a bookseller, and I get a call from my mom that there is a family emergency, and can I make the road trip from where I live in Indiana to my birthplace in Maryland to help out with this emergency. And so I decided I would. And this was at the time when people were discouraging travel and everything. So, it was really a bit risky to do so, but I went ahead and did so, and took care of some things that needed to be taken care of, and tried to be helpful to my family, and was there for over a week. And then it was interesting. The night before I was about ready to head back to Indiana, I really, didn't have any like hotel booked or anything. And because I had left really not knowing how long I was going to stay. So I thought to myself, well, maybe what I could do is, take a little swing by Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And because I've never been there. And at that point, I was just kind of thinking of it as like this fun, kitschy kind of pop culture place, right? I had never read the Mothman Prophecies. I had never watched the movie, The Mothman Prophecies. All I knew is that, Mothman was kind of like to the air what Bigfoot was to the forest, right? And so, I had never been really into cryptozoology all that much. When I was a kid, there was a local circus that came to town claiming to have Bigfoot frozen in ice. And I was terrified. I did not want to see Bigfoot frozen in ice. I was scared to death. My dad went and paid like the quarter or whatever to go see it. And of course, I think it was like a monkey suit, probably in a frozen in ice, but an ice suit in a freezer or something like that. But that's the kind of thing where I was terrified of it. But I decided, okay, I'm just going to go and there's, if you want to look at synchronicities and if you want to open yourself up to that whole world, you can say that synchronicities were at play. There I was the night before I left my house in southern Indiana. I just happened to have this idea of I could stop in Point Pleasant. And so I actually stopped in Gallipolis, just across the Ohio River from Point Pleasant. And I thought to myself, well, probably the museum's closed because this is like, May of 2020. So like a lot of places were closed. Retail establishments were closed. But it turned out just by chance, the museum had reopened a couple of days before. So I go over to the museum. And it was interesting because when I woke up in the morning at my hotel, I had a flat tire. And so I had to try to inflate the tire, which I did. And I had enough air to go across the bridge into Point Pleasant. So I go over to Point Pleasant and, I kind of have the place to myself because there's, it's the pandemic and it was early in the morning just after they had opened. And I was expecting to see like just kitschy stuff. And I saw, what I saw was, they have a lot of cool things at the Mothman Museum, the world's only Mothman Museum, as they state. And one of them is they have this testimonials of the people who saw it in they have them mounted to the wall, I think, in their handwriting. And so I saw that. And then, I asked the guy behind the counter, it's like, well, do you think there's anything to this stuff? And he said, well, the people who have seen it, he'd said that he had talked to some of the original eyewitnesses and, the folks who had seen it, and they all said that they wish they hadn't seen it. Mm-hmm. And that struck me as an unusual answer. And, not just something just kind of, brought up to amuse a tourist. And, and then I looked at, there was all this stuff about the Men in Black that was there. And then, I saw this unusual name like Indrid Cold. And I had no idea, I was like, what is Indrid Cold? What is this? And I think so that's one level of synchronicity. Another level of synchronicity, I was not going to buy anything when I went there because I was laid off from work. But I saw, a really cool edition of the Mothman Prophecies that had the Frank Frazetta cover. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, I thought, well, that's not something you find every day. And I work at it as a bookseller in addition to being a novelist. And it's like, I know that, that kind of cover might be kind of rare. So let me go ahead and get that. And I wasn't really going to read it, but then I opened it up when I got home and I started reading it. And then I was just hooked because you have this story that, you do have this kitschy kind of side to it, but you also have this David Lynch kind of side to it. Right. And then you have this working class kind of side to it. And I grew up in a working class family. I live in a working class subdivision, or I live in a working class subdivision here in Southern Indiana. I work in a working class job, all that kind of thing. And so, it's an Ohio River story. And I live along the shores of the Ohio River. I live in Southern Indiana, right on, I cross the Ohio River twice a day and I go to work. And so in some ways it's like, this is really the, set of folklore, if you want to look at it that way, that, was kind of perfect for me. It was kind of hand in glove. And a lot of my work is instigated by chance occurrences, like a sick ray laugh. I just happened to run into a book at a used bookstore about utopian cults that settled in Indiana in the 19th century. And from that, all these other things came about. With Mothwoman, I just happened to take this very unexpected trip to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and just happened to get into the museum and just happened to pick up a copy of the book and just happened to read it. It's basically led on this new adventure that I'm in my life where I'm openly contemplating ideas that would have deeply embarrassed me to be contemplating even a few years ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. I guess. Yeah, it's so hard to know why these kind of like shifts in. I don't know if the word is like, it's not a shift in consciousness so much as like a shift in like willingness to contemplate certain things. Yeah, it's like it does, it like shifts the light on the world kind of. And I think that those are like such important moments. I
think that's like a really fascinating anecdote too, and it's perfect because the Mothman Prophecies kind of serves as like this apex point of the paranormal subject, right? Where maybe
it's kind of like where everything meets, right? You have all these kinds of paranormal phenomena kind of coalescing in the Mothman story.
Yeah, and you also have Gray Barker's book, The Silver Bridge, which kind of gets into that metafiction, playing with the narrative of the testimonials as well. But yeah, I mean, I've done some traveling on the Ohio River Valley of what you're talking about, and it feels like such an enchanted part of the country, which I think is kind of maybe funny for a lot of people to hear because they overlook like the Midwest region, but it feels like an area super rich in folklore and even ancient history with the mound builders cultures and such. Do you find that area inspiring your work a lot?
Well, yeah, it does. And it's interesting because I, there's a liminal aspect to it for me because I was born in Maryland. I lived in Maryland until I was about 30 years old. And I have spent just about the last 20 years here in southern Indiana and or Louisville, Kentucky. And, bouncing kind of from one side of the river to the other. I've been in southern Indiana now for many years, but when I first kind of crash landed here to this area, that's a whole other story, a completely other random way I ended up over here. I wondered what, should I start writing about this area? I really, I'm in it, but I'm not really of it. When I talk to people around here, sometimes they'll say you don't sound like you come from around here. And so on the one hand, I married a guy who was born and raised in southern Indiana. So, and I feel deeply connected to this community, but I am to some degree still an outsider. Or a transplant. And so as a result, there's that liminal aspect of, on the one hand, I know what it's like to be a Hoosier. On the other hand, I have this outside perspective. So it's really interesting because I live and work here in this setting, but I'm not native to it. But I'm pretty darn attached to it, but I can also see it from the outside. And as a fiction writer, I think that comes in handy quite a bit.
Yeah, and as we opened with talking about the Shaver mystery too, Kentucky has the Mammoth Cave system going throughout the entire state. The Serpent Mound has that magnetic anomaly of the supposed being a meteor crash. I'm getting a little feedback from the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you hear
that? Yeah, it's funny because Shaver also, was... Yeah, he's kind of from out that way, right? He sort of settled out that way, but has sort of some roots not so far from where I'm at in Pennsylvania, too. So the Shaver thing's kind of an interesting little, circuit happening here, yeah.
Yeah, well, Shaver, I think he was originally from I think he traveled the rails. He was all over the place, and I think eventually he died when he was living somewhere down south. And I think for a while he had maybe a little farm in the Midwest. But I've been, and this is another kind of serendipitous kind of thing, where I was, my husband and I took a little day trip up to a little town called Yellow Springs, Ohio. And I ran into a couple copies of the original Shaver Mysteries Amazing Stories and episode issues, rather. I'm going to actually turn on my camera right now so you guys can see some of these lovelies here. There's one.
Oh, yeah, I saw you posted those. So
there's another.
Iconic.
Yeah, they're wonderful, and they're very, very strange. What I have taken away from them, I've only done a preliminary study of the Shaver Mysteries, but what I found is that none of the summaries that you hear about it really capture the full weirdness of what is on display in the Shaver Mysteries. And when you read them, they're not good science. I mean, there's some scientific statements that Shaver makes that are completely off the mark, and they're not really good fiction. It's not really well written fiction or anything, and it's not good science fiction. It's not neither nor good science nor good fiction nor good science fiction, and yet it's compelling as hell. And it's what do you call this? I mean, it's strangeness on top of strangeness on top of strangeness on top of strangeness. And so it also has a very interesting relationship, in terms of, again, to trot out an overused word, liminality. We can play liminality bingo there. If every time you hear liminality in this podcast episode, folks drink, but when you when you actually look at it, it's like there's so the first story is called I Remember Lemuria, and I have that was eventually published as its own book, and I have I also discovered a reprint of that book, and the editor of Amazing Stories was a guy named Ray Palmer, and so you have Shaver's story, and then you have Ray Palmer's like footnotes, and there's like all kinds of footnotes there trying to establish like, okay, here's what I think he's talking about. And you read some of the other stories, and there's statements made like, well, this story is completely true, or this story is completely false, except in its description of the caverns. And it's just very, very strange. And I think, I want to do a little bit more delving into it, because it's another, if you think about it, it could be another pole of the mystery. I mean, if you think about Mothman being one topic around which a lot of things coalesce, certainly with the Shaver mysteries, you have that's a whole other pole where a whole other set of things coalesce. And, it's interesting, like you look at what's in those issues and, alien abduction, that's one of the stories that, comes up is a discussion of alien abduction. And then there's a story called The Mind Rovers. And in that, like the headline or the little tagline beneath the story is this idea of, this supposedly happened in someone's imagination, but what is the imagination? And, there's this whole, openly admitting that, okay, maybe this stuff didn't happen in the material world that you and I live in from 9 to 5, but maybe it happened in some kind of midnight world that we inhabit from the, 3 a.m. to 4:15 a.m. or something. And all of this stuff, I mean, some of this stuff is the kind of thing you hear sometimes in Hellier and other things of like, this stuff is all in our minds. And that's okay. That's cool. It is all in our minds. But what does that mean?
Right.
And then you think, okay, this is like a really cool, brand new way of interpreting the paranormal. And then you look at Amazing Stories from the late 1940s, and there's this issue where the tagline says, what about the world of imagination in your own mind? Is it just fantasy, or is there something real in its existence? And so, Palmer and Shaver were perhaps doing trickster kinds of things where they were, kind of putting out a little, show and claiming that things were true that weren't true, or they were, or they were presenting things that were true as best as they could tell, but they didn't fully understand them, or parts of it were true and parts of it weren't true. And I think that's really interesting. And as a fiction writer, that's how I can, I think, intersect with the paranormal, that fiction writers are tricksters. And there's, just as there's the tradition in fiction writing of atheist horror writers, there's also, kind of like a counter tradition, or a counter example at least, of writers like Philip K. Dick, who were, deeply moved by their own personal spiritual experiences, perhaps induced by abuse of amphetamines in the case of Mr. Dick. But, we can't dismiss that possibility. But he had allegedly actual experiences with the paranormal, and that he kind of built his fiction around that. And I think I am not sure I've had actual experiences with the paranormal. I would like to be as objective as possible about that. And I think I can say I've had experiences that were paranormal, but I don't know whether they were just in my head, and if they were just daydreams, or if there was something more to it. And I think that's where I kind of have to stand, and probably where we always will be with this kind of thing, is this, especially when you you work, when you write meta fiction, right, and metafictional novels, the line between, fantasy and reality is something that you traipse across and hop across, constantly, and you have a big emotional attachment to. And so you're creating works of art, but they're always tied in some way to reality. And, if you jump over that line enough times, it's like the jumping over a chalk line in the dust. I mean, if you run around it enough, the line's going to get pretty, blurry.
Right.
It's like, I used to play softball, and the chalk line that marked the foul line would get kind of murky after playing on the field the whole time. And I think that's my experience as a fiction writer too, and as a spiritual person, is that the and as somebody who has had intense experiences in the midst of meditation and or the creative act, where it becomes indescribable where you stand in terms of whether things are literally true or if it's a daydream. And if it is a daydream, what does that mean? And that's the whole David Lynch idea, the paranormal, and at the same time, I think it is helpful not to take yourself too seriously and to just like realize that you don't know everything and that you might just be silly.
No, that's so, that's a lot of material. That's awesome. I think one thing that I thought of when you're sort of asking what Shaver's writings are, if they're not this, they're not that, they're not, and then I feel like, especially in the way he pairs with Palmer, it's almost like Palmer's writing these like exegetical notes to Shaver, who is the revelation. Like Shaver is sort of like the prophet in that situation. Or at least, and that's certainly something that I think Palmer was prone to, was like getting hooked by like modern day sort of Bibles or something. Like he got really into that Oaspe Bible. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah. So I feel like maybe part of the Shaver mystery was kind of like this weird quasi-religious thing. And my way out there kind of theory is that like the Shaver mystery sort of was this weird kind of, maybe like a pole, like you were saying, or like some sort of like ritual situation that helped bring about like the modern UFO age or something like that.
It's fascinating. And I don't know. I mean, and at the same time, there was a big commercial aspect to it because Ray Palmer sold a hell of a lot of magazines. That's one of the reasons why you can still find those magazines in secondhand shops, is there was a hell of a lot of them printed and a hell of a lot of them sold. And so did he have a commercial motive to promote this as true? Absolutely. Did he sound at the end of his life, and some of the lectures I've heard him give, like a true believer? Absolutely. And so it's like a lot of things in the paranormal, the more you investigate the individuals involved, it doesn't end up getting you any closer to a resolution.
Absolutely.
Palmer was an intriguing guy. Shaver was an intriguing guy. Like, there's lots of people who spend time in mental hospitals, as apparently Shaver did for 8 years. But not all of them come out and write massive amounts of stories, or say that they came up with, or say that rather that they discovered this, kind of like primary alphabet, right? This language that Shaver says that he came across, which is like the building blocks of all language, and then submit it to Amazing Stories. There's so many people who've been in psychiatric hospitals who don't then go on to write all this massive amount of stuff. And then of course apparently Shaver had a career in the visual arts too. So by any measure,
it's
Shaver
amazing.
He's an extraordinary individual.
I mean, his rock art paintings are like incredible. And I think as far as I know from looking into it, like the science fiction fans of the day, like, were buying up that magazine because they hated it so much. Like it was so unpopular that it was a kind of like like it was in like the fan culture, it was like kind of reviled, but it kind
Yeah.
of found a second life in the like paranormal kind of like the flying saucer buffs and stuff.
Right.
Yeah, it sold very well, but it was a different kind of fan. So you had the original school of science fiction where it was more about demonstrating human progress and what progress would result in through the application of science principles, and often being meticulous about the application of the science. And then you have, something like I Remember Lemuria, where, it's just strangeness piled atop strangeness. And it's not even, I mean, there's been lots of strangeness in Lovecraft and weird tales and, Yog Sothoth and, and it is more strange than even that. And partially because there's just, there's no real focus. And in Lovecraft, you're following one thread, and you're kind of going down one path where, and that gets kind of stranger and more eldritch and more non-Euclidean with every passing mile. But with it's almost as if with the Shaver mysteries and Amazing Stories, you are at a constant crossroads. And there's, it's not like this little path going that's becoming more and more strange. It's like there's things swinging through vines, and there's things coming out of the ground, and then there's things coming at you in all directions, and they all look very strange. And and the science is really awful. So it's you just never have an opportunity to even follow the narrative, because there's the minute you start to kind of get a sense of what's going on, there's this other very strange aspect of it that's introduced that requires a whole other explanation of its own. Like any one of the characters in the Shaver mysteries could have its own novel devoted to it, and they're all crammed in very oddly, and it makes for laborious reading, but at the same time intoxicating reading to some degree.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mention Lovecraft in the case of metafiction as well. His inclusion of the Necronomicon, the fabled text. Obviously, for him it was a fiction, but then it sort of becomes its own mythology through writers like Peter Levenda, and then before that Kenneth Grant, who adopted into this sort of like new occult mythology. Do you ever think about egregores in your own work maybe becoming realized in that sort of way for people?
Oh, goodness. Part of me hopes not, because my work is so goddamn dark. But it's also, I mean, part of what I do is satire too. And so, I mean, there's, it's kind of like slapstick tragedy, right? Where, I don't think my work has the same tone of reverence that would lead to something like that, unless it was, if people wanted to, long after I'm dead, or even, when I'm on my deathbed, if people want to be like, create some kind of trickster tome or some kind of like half serious sort of spoof, that might be more in the spirit of my work. But and that's not to say that I don't have an appreciation for ritual and for taking all of this seriously. But part of my personality, just the way I've always been, is to constantly look at the humorous side of things, usually at like a darkly, bitterly, kind of grimly gallows humor sort of a perspective on things. And so my rituals are the rituals of the laugh and the wince, and the ritual of the laughing wince. How about that? And so maybe that would be the kind of tome that would be created by true believers in my work. But and I've written about occult rituals before, actually. I had wrote a novella called Children of No One that has one included in it. And so, but at the time, I didn't know anything about the occult, and so I had to reach out to somebody who was familiar with it to kind of get a sense of what sort of ritual might work. So yeah, and I don't think that's at the core of my work. But you know, the thing is, most writers end up forgotten. That's just the cold hard facts, especially nowadays. So probably what will happen is my books will end up on a few bookshelves until the people who own them die, and then they'll be brought to a secondhand store. And you know, if someone might pick them up or might not, and you know, a lot of them will probably get tossed in the trash, and then some people might find value in them. Who knows? But you know, I think longevity and you know, let alone posterity is a difficult proposition for folks. But it kind of helps to know that going into it, that, you know, it's like, well, maybe all I have is right now, so I'm just going to be as weird and as and enjoy the ride while I can.
Yeah. Even like with Mothwoman, though, are you curious about the effect of maybe entering into like the Mothman mythos yourself, in terms of like your writing maybe acting as some sort of sigil, interacting with this larger window area of the phenomena itself or something?
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about I mean, this is like, I guess I'm the holy fool in a sense. You know, I'm kind of walking into this with very little preparation and really not sure how that would affect people if that were to happen, if this were a sigil, if this, you know, if this was a, you know, I think that even by modest standards, any novel is in a sense a magical working, simply because I'm taking, you know, symbols on a page and using them to evoke a change of consciousness and to invoke another reality in the reader. So simply a very mundane experience with a novel is in fact not mundane, but rather magical. But that having been said, I really must admit that if something like this does happen, I think my intentions for this have always been good. My intentions have simply been to create art, and to perhaps be a part of. I mean, I never really thought of like, okay, I am joining the Mothman lore. You know, that's right. It's never. I've never really, you know, gone into it with that level of aspiration. What I've wanted to do is simply tell the story that I felt compelled to tell. And that's the thing, is like the stories I tell are oftentimes out of my control. And I've had experiences with automatic writing too. And not so much with this novel, but other experiences. And so it's kind of like, I always say with the characters in my books, it's a little bit, the experience I have is what I call dual possession. So it's like, I'm being possessed by the character's being possessed by me, and we're kind of working along on this thing, and we're on this journey together. And so a lot of it, I feel like I'm not necessarily driving the vehicle. And so
that comes across in the Half Freaks book, right? That's kind of like, it's like an illustration of that, right?
Yeah, totally. And so it's like, you know, I feel like I'm not quite at the wheel all the time, and therefore I leave it to others to work out if this will add anything to the mythos or to become a working or a ritual. I just hope, you know, my approach as far as any of this goes is to help. I mean, my hope is that just everyone be kind to each other, right? I mean, and everyone, you know, just take a deep breath and keep their feet on the ground to some degree. And you know, I like what the folks from Hellier have to say. The Newkirks, they always say, like, keep one foot in this world and one foot out, right? As a way of kind of keeping tethered. And so that would be my only investment in it. But I also know that the paranormal is not something that can be easily reined in. And so maybe people will find it to have some greater significance. And as long as the healthy interest and it's something that is safe, and as long as they're approaching it in a sense of kind of keeping one foot in, one foot out, then I'm all for that.
Yeah, I guess you kind of have to. I feel like we both do that here on this show. We try and keep one foot on the safe side, but yeah, well, I mean,
yeah, if you go all the way through the mirror, it's pretty spooky on the other side. So you want to keep a foot on the other side to get back, right?
Right. And part of me thinks that's why Lovecraft maybe was an atheist. I mean, if you think about it, Lovecraft's father went insane.
Right.
And Lovecraft had, nightmares about being taken, kidnapped basically out of his bed by creatures he called night gaunts, who are winged creatures, with kind of leathery wings that would take him away to, I guess other planets. Right. And so, I mean, if someone was looking at it from the UFO camp, the ufological camp, well, is Lovecraft an experiencer? Is Lovecraft an abductee? Well, and Lovecraft would probably look at that kind of thing and think, that's the kind of thing my dad would have thought. And so I have to draw this very clear line between what is pure imagination and what is fact. And I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, not to play armchair psychologist. I can't imagine, I'm not going to do H.P. Lovecraft's thinking for him or try to dissect his consciousness. But I think if you had a history of mental illness, I think his mother also had mental illness too. Yeah. You have these nightmares. You have to be very careful and kind of say, okay, I'm not going to go mad like they did. And I have to draw this very clear line and say, like, no dealings with the supernatural. I am a materialist. I don't believe in any of that stuff. And that's might be a coping mechanism for very traumatizing experiences in the realm of dreams.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
I think
a really interesting way to look at his background and stuff, for sure.
I wonder, the sort of like mental illness psychology thing is, I mean, that comes up in your work a lot too. And it's also, kind of essential to, not essential, it's at least needed to sort of get the full picture of like the Shaver mythos or any of these things, because it so often at least looks like it could be explained by that. And then often the closer you look, the less that really makes all that much sense. But there is always that kind of like madness, for like a antique term for it, like that dimension to it. And my several strange experiences have always kind of been on that line. Do you think, so is that sort of like something you worry about in terms of, like maybe Lovecraft was, and pulling back from it in that way? Do you?
Yeah, I do.
It, or yeah,
I do. Honestly, I mean, I had a conversation with my psychiatrist about all this.
Yeah.
and said, well, do you think I'm crazy, Doc? And he said, well, I don't think you're crazy. And he said to me, I don't think you think you're crazy, but, he did insinuate that I might be going through a midlife crisis. So, it's like, maybe there he has something there. But, I mean, it's, for me, like, the mental health concern that's really done me in the worst is obsessive compulsive disorder, where before I started medication for it, it was really to the point where it was almost paranoia. So, and I say that openly just because, if I'm making any kind of paranormal claim, I feel like I need to give the disclaimer of, I've never experienced like the kinds of things that people with schizophrenia necessarily experience. Aside from like one time when after a friend died, I did hear her call my name. And that was interesting. And that's an experience that even Carl Sagan reported having after I think his mom died. But he, apparently that's a kind of like a common hallucination is what, he kind of came to arrive at that conclusion. So I think for me, it's, I've had experiences where I have seen something that seemed to me that was a paranormal sort of vision. And then, and telling myself, okay, that's not real. And then looking over and saying, well, maybe it is real. And I think that line between, okay, what's real and what's not real is difficult. And it's always difficult. Like one of the things that I really struggled with the most during the, before I got on medicine for OCD was just it was terrible not being able to trust my own brain. It's a horrible feeling. And so, and I don't want to experience anything like that ever again. But, I always take my medication. I personally belong to, I'm not I take my Zoloft, that's my team Zoloft. Yay. And I'm on a horse dose of it. And as long as I take that, I'm fine. But I think that, and I don't do alcohol or drugs anymore. I haven't done that. And, it'll be coming up on 18 years here. So, so it's not that, but I think I have a fervent imagination. And so anytime you have a fervent imagination, and then there's, you have, so-called pareidolia, there's the, and then you realize, to some degree, reality is difficult to define that are, well, even if you look at, this isn't anything original that I'm sharing with you, but the idea that, okay, so our senses are limited in the sense that we can only see certain things. There's certain waves of light that are beyond our perception. There are certain waves of sound, I suppose, that are also beyond our perception. That the fleshy parts in my head can only process so much information. And so there may very well be things out there that exist that are beyond our perception, or just the point that reality is always in our head. People can say, well, this is just in your head. Well, the perception of the cell phone in which I'm talking into is also in my head, because it's all happening in my brain. Right. And so, then we get very deep about like, what is consciousness? What is reality? And, if I experience an altered state of consciousness, is that any less real? What makes it less real? And those are difficult questions that we can entertain, but I try not to entertain them too much, because if I do, I'm worried that I'm going to become some kind of like dropout from society. End up like,
that's so fascinating and such an apt description of things, I think. And whether it's real or not, or it applies to some like immaterial doctrine of perception occurring in your brain, everybody's pooling this into like their own pattern recognition. And some people have, different, more hyperactive senses of pattern recognition. And I think that pull of narrative is something so fascinating. It reminds me of that story that the Yellow King, right, is the one where
the King in Yellow.
Yeah. The King in Yellow. Yeah. Right. Where the story is so powerful that it pulls people in. Yeah. I guess there's no real question there. Just a comment on.
No, you're fine. I just enjoy talking. I'm a big ham, and I'm also a good listener. So I enjoy just hearing your thoughts as well. Because that really, I mean, that's what we're here to do. I think if we're here to do anything, is to share with each other and like, here's my ideas, here's your ideas. One of the things if I have one kind of rule as far as investigating the paranormal. And when I say investigating, I don't mean like going out and ghost hunting or something, but just like, surveying it, is that there should be no hierarchy, nor should there be any ruler, no gurus.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good to realize that no one has a monopoly on accuracy as far as this thing goes, and that when you have that approach, then anyone can be questioned, right? And that's a very healthy way of going about it. And it also kind of ties into some wisdom from Taoism. I mean, Taoism, one of the things that Taoism has said is, the way that can be spoken of is not the true way, right? And with the idea that, if you can sum this all up and you can, kind of explicitly say, well, the way the world works is, here's the 500 ways that the world works, and I've written it all up in 500 pages, and now and these are all the answers. What Taoism kind of says is like the way that can be spoken of is not the true way. The way that life is always more complicated than what can be put into writing or put into a picture or put into an EVP or, whatever you want to say, any kind of documentation. And my cat is starting to come visit me and meow, so you may hear her. But so I think that we have to have some humility about it and try to have some fun with it, but also treat it with the respect it deserves. And so, kind of go into it with but at the same time, try to be as relaxed as we can with it. And be kind to each other. I think that's the main things, I think. And not, of course, Twitter is probably the worst place for all that.
Right.
So,
it brings us together to some great thinkers and stuff occasionally.
Yeah, but that's true. We connected through Twitter.
Yeah.
So we can't really say anything bad about it on that angle, but it's just there's so much, anger and frustration, and some of it valid, but but at the same time, I just I think if we're trying to seek out things that are healthy and transcendent, and at the same time we're driven by anger or fear or resentment, then I perhaps that opens the door to some very negative things. And so that my approach is always to try as much as possible to be kind and also to be humble and be responsible.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of like our MO here too, is I think we're, I don't know, I'm speaking for Ben a little bit too, but I think we're like not as interested in parsing out the facts of these things. I think it's more about people's stories, and it's about the people involved. And like you mentioned before, when you look at characters involved in phenomena, whether it be Shaver and Palmer or UFO contactees, I think it's really about, investigating people's stories and how they make sense of these strange events that happen to them. And that's kind of where we really, I think, find a lot of joy in this thing, is trying to really get in there and figure out, people's tales.
Yeah, Woody Derenberger, for example.
Yeah,
I mean, there's this guy, just some guy who, allegedly has this contact, and then allegedly has even more contacts, and so it's like, I've always been interested in him, and always been curious about, if he had any connection with Gray Barker, maybe before all that happened. It's like I just, but
it's a family affair too. His daughter wrote the other Lanulos book, right?
Right, I read her book as well, and she appeared on Hellier. So, and part of what I love about the Mothman legend and about the Shaver legend too, and about this whole world of paranormal phenomena is that, like, you have this idea in some of the older science fiction that, like okay, in the day the Earth stood still, where does the flying saucer land? It lands on like the White House lawn or something, I think, or the National Mall or something like that. But here, like, what I love is in the Mothman story, you have like UFOs landing in some kind of like parking lot in West Virginia. And then you have them, like, the aliens drive like a Volkswagen Beetle and pick Woody Derenberger up. And then it's like it's not, it's like these everyday places, or even like kind of grubby kind of places and these aliens are like, they don't look out of the ordinary except for some unusual traits, and it's just it's like it's immersed in the everyday and the workaday and the blue collar world. And that's the thing. And if you ever listen to, Our Strange Skies, it's another one of my favorite podcasts. Great podcast. And the podcast host there is always doing, kind of goes through like old issues of Flying Saucer magazines from, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and talks about these stories. And that, they're just happening in random places. It's like not any place that is like particularly important, or it's just everyday places, and people have these experiences, and they're not like so-called important people, and they're not happening in so-called important places. And as somebody who lives in in the Ohio Valley and lives in southern Indiana, and if I'm in a cab in Southern California and I tell people I'm from Indiana, and they'll say, well, what, the potato state? No, that's Idaho. It's like it is kind of rewarding to see these phenomena in these unlikely places.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's kind of like it'll pop up anywhere, and it has no real bearing on what our our society at any given point deems like central or important. It kind of has its own agenda, I guess. And it's mysterious.
And if you listen to Hellier, and part of what they say is like, well, being like areas that might be like a little bit sketchy, that like, outsider status, that leads people to, that's kind of liminal territory.
Right.
And so, that's another idea. And they have, like, in Hellier, there's that whole experience of, people who are on the outside, like the teacher who was then incarcerated, and she has this kind of outsider status, and maybe she, as a result of that, has, the phenomena is more attracted to her. So I think there's something oddly, satisfying about that. That phenomena is like rooting for the underdog in some way. Or maybe not rooting for the underdog, but interested in the underdog.
Right.
Yeah. It's so fascinating too, because like something like the Serpent Mound is a glaring mystery that's just staring at America, and it's largely unknown and ignored.
Right.
But nobody knows, really the true history of who built it or even how old it is. So I don't know. It's kind of weird that the phenomena like emanates from a place like that. That's kind of already historically enchanted in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Are you there's like that sort of nexus of like the shaver type shaver Mothman. Speaking of which, I've been listening to old Coast to Coast episodes lately. When I'm sitting, I'm also in a bookshop, not right now, but every day, and I just put on old Coast to Coast, and I listened to, I think, the only interview that Art Bell ever did with John Keel, and for some reason Art Bell had not heard of the Mothman thing at all, which was shocking to me. But so he's kind of like asking, and so it's kind of like John Keel explaining this whole situation, like with like a sort of fresh take on it. So it's just like kind of a, I don't remember where I was going with that, but I do remember.
Well, it sounds like it was he was telling the story from from a perspective, probably sometime in the 80s, and looking back and telling it from beginning to end in a way that, might be good for a newcomer to have that. And I think that's the thing is like, I guess, Art Bell was, I'm not sure how many years he was active, but if this was happening like in the 80s or the 90s, I mean, I'll date myself right here. I'm proud of my age. I was born in 73, and I don't recall hearing about the Mothman until the movie came out. And, I would sometimes I wasn't overly involved, interested in cryptids, but I would watch In Search Of when I was a kid because I like spooky stuff. And I don't remember seeing anything about Mothman on there. And, if you kind of think about the places where the Mothman would have come up, In Search Of or Unsolved Mysteries or, any of those kinds of shows, it never really came to the folks' awareness until the movie came out.
Right. Now it's everywhere.
Yeah, totally. Now it's everywhere. It's, so that's what a film adaptation can do. I mean, the copy of the Mothman Prophecies that I have with the, with that really vivid cover, that was put out by Illuminate Press. Which is
I have that one too.
Which was a small press, and so a small publishing company. And now the rights are owned, I think, by Tor Publishing, which is involved in a larger publishing conglomerate. So because there's a lot more interest in it now, and so it's just very interesting how these things can really be in obscurity. And I'm sure part of the reason why it was in obscurity is it's such a goddamn weird story. And who would be in, I'm sure some executive would be like, yeah, who's interested in that? And, well, it's kind of science fiction, but it's also kind of horror. And it's hard as I'm sure, I'm imagining some executive being like, what are people being carved up? Is it like Freddy? No, it's not like Freddy. It's and so I'm sure, I mean, getting the financing for that film had to be pretty interesting, and things have to come together. And then
that's
as a
story
result,
I'd love to hear. I wish someone would write a book about the how that movie came together. And I wonder, because when I think about, I mean, it wasn't always this way, but when I think about who would come to mind for most people when you mention cryptozoology, usually it's Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Chupacabra. But slowly, somehow, over the last couple of years, I feel like Mothman is kind of those other ones have become too almost part of the landscape, and now Mothman is sort of the more active face of that thing right now. And it's I get these patches that these iron-on patches that this artist makes, and I sell them at my shop, and that all the kids are always buying the Mothman one, and it's
I mean, and
they love it.
It's really fascinating because when you think about it, I have the cute Mothman mug, and I have a stuffed Mothman on my window. And, when you think about it, there were people who saw this creature and were traumatized. It's one of the witnesses had to go to a hospital for, several days after seeing this creature, because she couldn't sleep. And she was having basically, I think, what we would now call symptoms of PTSD. She was afraid it was going to show up again. And so, it's almost like the same phenomena with the plush Cthulhu dolls that you see everywhere, where it's you have this creature that it originates in lore as completely menacing and hideous and insanity inducing, and then now it's become cuddly and almost like this Disney thing. I can't, Disney's Mothman coming next to Disney Plus.
That's so funny. I was just thinking about that. Did you see they had this poster recently for the new Pinocchio thing, and the tagline is "You can't kill what never lived," and it's the most cosmic horror tagline for a Pinocchio movie.
That's the old ones or something.
You can't kill what never lived.
No, that's really funny too, considering the connection obviously that Mothman has with the tragedy of and the prophetic visions of tragedy with like the Silver Bridge collapse. Now it's kind of totally, like champion of cryptozoology.
What does that mean then? That like this sort of icon of impending doom is sort of like exponentially spreading across the culture. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that could explain a lot.
Yeah.
True.
But I think it also just goes to like, it's like how many people know that it's, tied to possibly the demolition of not demolition, but the failure of the bridge over the Ohio River at Point Pleasant and Gallipolis. It's one of those things where people have a little bit of knowledge about it. And that's all, it's like kind of like I was before I went to visit the museum. I just thought, oh, Mothman, this kitschy, kind of weird, thing, Bigfoot's avian kin. Yeah, cool. That's awesome. And it'll be fun. It's just so strange and kitschy. And then, you start reading the book and, and then you get into this whole other aspect of things where, it's like, it's so strange and, and it's dark and it's at the same time kind of odd and in some cases even a little bit funny. And so, I mean, most people, it's like, and that's where the plush Cthulhu kind of thing comes in too. Like most people who own the plush Cthulhus might know Cthulhu from like the role-playing games or the video games or anything like that. They probably have not read the Call of Cthulhu or, they haven't read a whole lot of Lovecraft. They don't know about cosmicism necessarily. Maybe they do. And they're just kind of expressing, their interest in it ironically or with a little bit whistling through the graveyard. That's what we tend to do with this kind of stuff anyway. That's like the Halloween decorations of like the child-friendly ghost and the child-friendly vampire and the vampires that look like they have like big kid eyes and like little they look like SpongeBob characters or something. Not like ghouls. I think we all have this tendency in any cultural endeavor to make the grotesque more accessible. And that's part of the liminality of it too. It's like, again, I just said liminality, go ahead and drink. Because Halloween is like, not only is it allegedly the time when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest, but it's also at this point where the, you have this, this meeting of the innocence of the holiday and the terror of the holiday, and you have children participating in this in a ritual, if you want to call it that, of trick-or-treating. I don't want to give any fodder for the fundamentalists who would say that trick-or-treating is a ritual, but in a way, kind of weird, kind of sociological way, it might be. And I go to the house, I put out a bag, I'm wearing a costume, I get something in the bag, I say thank you, or my parent forces me to say thank you. And so you have this weird kind of bridge, between the grotesque and death on the one hand, and youth with the children, and with innocence in the way that these characters are kind of, goofily, illustrated. I whenever I put Halloween decorations out, I make them very kid friendly because we had small children who come to our house on the holiday to trick or treat. We have many trick or treaters, about 100 every year. And I always, I always want it to be inviting to them. I don't want, and the house across the street does all the gory stuff and everything. They do all the the Freddy and Jason stuff. So we'll, our house is like, like little cute cartoon Frankenstein and everything. It's more accessible, but it is this odd, connection between two extremes that only exist for that one night.
Right.
And
yeah, I feel like you see that encapsulated perfectly in the film House, the Japanese film Houseu. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah.
One? Yeah.
I'm trying to think. That sounds. Is that the one with the cat?
Yeah.
It's I've seen. I have the Blu-ray, and my husband and I watched it, and it's just so strange.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. It's like this this generational meeting point, and you have like the kitschy cuteness meeting like the gore and the macabre, but it's like an allegory for the generational loss of the atomic bomb. And how the absurdity of that horror couldn't be conveyed through fiction, so it just has to be portrayed with like absolute aesthetic absurdity. But yeah, I don't know.
Wow.
It's a pretty great one. I don't know if listeners.
Yeah, I've watched it and I enjoyed it, and I need to rewatch it probably. But that's part of what stories do for us, right? They make sense of, well, and sometimes not even make sense of things. I mean, I don't think about my work as a novelist in terms of like a therapeutic approach necessarily. I just, I'm trying to just convey what I need to convey, and everything. But I think when you do that, someone else needs to hear that too. And there's a community that comes about, like, if nothing else, because people can relate to how you're thinking and feeling about the world. And so that's the comfort of fiction, I think, is just the comfort of community that, I know that the world is weird. That the world is weird. When you read my book, you share that, okay, somebody gets it. The world is weird. Right. And at the same time, they experience that in an entertaining way that will make them laugh, make them cry, and just give them a really cool, kind of like make their neurons tingle. That's what I really try to do, because that's what I love. And that's the kind of fiction that I love. I love fiction that makes my neurons tingle. And that's what I need. And that's what I try to aspire to.
Actually, that was another thing. I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask you who's currently writing sort of horror or horror adjacent fiction that you would recommend, because we don't have fiction writers on much.
Well, I mean, there's a couple that come to mind immediately. Brian Evanson is one. He writes he's written novels. He's also written a number of short story collections. Very weird stuff that I enjoy, and I would call it kind of horror adjacent. He's published by kind of a more of a literary press. He's and so it's called Coffee House Press. But so he's kind of in there with a lot of literary fiction writers, and he's somebody who kind of straddles the line between literary fiction and horror fiction. So he's one. Of course, Thomas Ligotti is another who I really enjoy. Caitlin Kiernan. She wrote a book called The Drowning Girl.
I love that book.
And which could definitely all the things that we've been talking about mental health and about experiences of the unreal and the paranormal. All of that could be, apply to The Drowning Girl. And Caitlin is very clear that they are not a horror author. And so, I respect that. And so take that with the caveat that, that you have there. But certainly I found it unsettling, an unsettling read. And so those are folks who are writing now. If you want to look at folks who've written before, of course, Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House is, I think, the finest horror novel that was ever written. And I know there was a Netflix series or something made with that title.
Did you see it?
I did not see it. I haven't seen it either. I don't watch a whole lot of TV.
Yeah.
And I don't have Netflix, and
Yeah.
so, but the book, is it has one of the best first lines I've ever read in a novel. Something to the effect that, no human being can live in constant connection with reality. It says it far more poetically than I just said it. So I'm not at all quoting from it, but that first line is so delightful, and it kind of sets the mood early on about this character's connection with the paranormal, and this character's connection with the real and the unreal. And my understanding is that Shirley Jackson was somebody who discussed having seen ghosts in her actual existence. So so I would definitely encourage her. And I like, there's actually, I like weird European stuff, stuff from like Poland. There's one of my favorite writers is a guy named Witold Gombrowicz, Gombrowicz, and he wrote a book called Cosmos, which is, the current publisher of the English translation calls it a metaphysical thriller. But it deals with some of the same things we're talking about, although kind of in an oblique, kind of adjacent way. But those are the kind of folks that I enjoy.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think Legati especially is, for some reason, I feel like kind of comes up in this context, even though I don't know if his philosophy really gels that well with like a sort of paranormal outlook. But he's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, he is. I mean, he's a brilliant man, and a brilliant writer. One of the best prose stylists that the horror field has ever had, and has a real vision of the world. It's a very dark vision. And the idea being that all these things that go through our heads are really not real. So it's materialism taken to the nth degree, where we think that we think, but we really don't think. There are just these chemical reactions going on in our heads, and we're just puppets being kind of moved around by these chemical forces. Lots of ideas of like, well, it would be better if we had not been born. And this kind of thing. I say laughing after that, because that's kind of like, that's my sense of humor. Yes, I'm demented, folks.
What can you do but laugh sometimes with that?
Yeah, totally. I think like there's two sides of Legati, right? There's Legati, the fiction writer, and then there's Legati, the philosopher or the philosophical commentator. And so I think Legati, the fiction writer, can be appreciated strictly on the power of the stories, and you can kind of take more take the nonfiction, the philosophical commentary, as kind of take it or leave it, without necessarily abandoning the fiction with it. But the keystone of Legati's worldview is this idea that existence equals nightmare, and that's a line from one of his short stories, actually. But the way I look at the world is different, and I've kind of, this is another thing that's kind of come in the last few years, where at one point I was very much on board with Legati's way of looking at the world, and it's not strictly Legati's way of looking at the world. Lots of philosophers have felt this way. Schopenhauer probably most prominently, but there's more recent philosopher named David Benatar, who wrote a book called Better Never to Have Been. Along the same line, there's other philosophers in this kind of tradition, and of course people are probably aware of the phrase or the word natalism that kind of became in vogue through the work of Ligotti and I guess some others too. But I don't believe that existence equals nightmare. I believe that existence equals nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been my experience. That, you know, and it kind of goes along with Taoism too, the idea that the way that can be spoken is not the true way. And if I think that I know something, you know, then, and this has been the history of my thought life. I mean, you know, I will believe something but I have this conviction that I have to follow the truth wherever it leads. And so as a result, I end up questioning it and abandoning it. And that's been my entire life. I will have a belief system. I'll adhere to it, and then I'll start to question it, and then I'll leave it, and then I'll move on to something else. And my husband says that he never has to have an affair because he's been with you know, just by being married to me, he's been with 5 different women during the course of our marriage. Because I'm always changing.
Yeah, the quest. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of our listeners out there can relate to that. I mean, I certainly can. It's almost its own sort of system, is that kind of shedding and then regrowing these belief system sort of skeletons, or I'm not sure. Yeah,
that's like Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnels, kind of moving through these conceptions of reality and then shedding them and moving into the next thing. But I think maybe we could talk about where we could link to some of your work for our listeners.
Yeah, totally.
Well,
I'm on Twitter. That's how this whole thing got arranged, is via Twitter. So on Twitter, I'm at Nicole Cushing. You can stop by my website, NicoleCushing.com, or check out your bookseller, your local independent bookstore. You know, you can check out and see if they have any of my titles or if they would order one for you. Bookshop.org is a good resource for that too. There's Carmichael's bookstore in Louisville has signed copies of my work. My publisher is a publisher named Word Horde. They publish most of my work. WORDHORDE. And if you Google them, they also have access to copies of my books that have signed book plates inserted in the book. So, awesome. You know, the book itself is not signed, but there's signed book plates that are kind of affixed to the inside of them. And, they are, the publisher there is a wonderful guy named Ross Lockhart. He's recently had some medical issues. He was in the hospital for almost a month. And that might, we might see a little bit of a delay in getting Mothwoman out, in part based on that. But he also is a bookstore owner. He owns a place out in Petaluma, California called the Word Horde Emporium of the Weird and Fantastic. And so if you're in Northern California, check that place out. It's going to be reopening in a new location soon, and you can buy my books there, or you can buy them online through there. He's also doing a GoFundMe to help with the relocation expenses, which is a whole other story in and of itself, but that's an important cause to keep in mind too.
Awesome. Yeah. Great. So you think coming out in 2022, the new book at some point?
I'm hopeful about that.
Cool.
You know, it's these things are a little bit unpredictable when you're working with the small press.
Of course, yeah.
You know, and so, but that's definitely my hope. I'm really, I mean, this is the fun part about writing is you write it and then you want people to see it. And so I'm really looking forward to getting this in readers' hands and just hearing about what people think of it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it too, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll try to get copies off to you guys.
Cool. Amazing.
Awesome.
Do you, as an exit, do you want to name some of your favorite horror movies growing up?
Oh gosh, growing up.
Or you could go general, but yeah, it was
in general.
Yeah.
Oh, Night of the Living Dead. The original 1968 masterpiece. Creep Show. Martin. I love, a lot of the stuff from George Romero. I just love his approach to things. Again, an Ohio Valley guy from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. and someone who I just adore his take on the world.
Awesome.
Yeah, those are scary still.
yeah.
I watched that recently. It's
sure.
scary.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This has been.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. You have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, it's really been wonderful. Thanks so much.
Oh, I'm happy to help anytime.
All right.